Thank you. Welcome to the podcast today, guys. My guest today, Dr. Yvonne Ridley. Before I launch into asking her questions, I want to paint the context of what we're going to be talking about and what the underlying situation was when she was captured by the Taliban. On the 11th of September 2001, the Twin Towers in New York were attacked by hijackers through a plane. Now, panic, mayhem, despair, death took over not only New York, but the whole of America, and left the rest of the world in absolute awe of what was going on. And so out of retaliation, America decided on a pretense that Osama bin Laden, who was claimed to have masterminded the attacks, was in Afghanistan. Bearing in mind that the hijackers were not Afghan, and that Afghanistan had nothing to do with New York, 9/11, or any attacks that took place. And so with that pretense that Osama bin Laden, the mastermind, was in some kind of cave in Afghanistan, in Dr. Yvonne's words herself, the richest country in the world would bomb one of the poorest countries in the world. And now that it's approaching the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, since the time that the bombardment took place in Afghanistan because of 9/11, America's own situation of 9/11 has become Afghanistan's 24/7. And so that terror, that panic, that helplessness, the death, the despair is what Afghanistan goes through every single day. And so as I've brought Yvonne in, Dr. Yvonne Ridley in today, I want her to take us back as to her experience with the Taliban, how that has evolved her and her work as a journalist, and what that means for Afghanistan in her sense of where Afghanistan would be in the next few days, months, years from her analysis as being a correspondent to these issues for such a long time. So Yvonne, you're the chief reporter for the Sunday Express newspaper in London when 9/11 took place. Could you please take us back as to why you went to Afghanistan? What's going on? How did you even get to Afghanistan in the first place?
Well, this was the biggest story since JFK was assassinated, since man landed on the moon. It was the first time in America's history that anyone had invaded, and it was just, well, apart from when the British set fire to the White House a few hundred years earlier, this was, you know, huge. So as chief reporter, I packed my bag and headed off to the airport to go to New York. That's where the story was breaking. But by this time, America had closed down her airspace, had sealed her borders. Nobody was getting in and out of the country. And that's the way it was for the next 3-4 days. And while I was waiting in the airport to get on that first flight out, my boss called me and he said, the story is now developing in Asia. We want you to go to Pakistan. And of course, I was quite reluctant. You know, I knew nothing about the culture, nothing about the people. Did I need an injection? You know, was it safe? But anyway, I went out to Pakistan, and it was a good call because within a week, more than 3,000 journalists from around the world had assembled in Islamabad, Peshawar, and various other major towns and cities in Pakistan, waiting for the war to start in neighboring Afghanistan. All the media had been kicked out of Afghanistan, by the way. That's why we assembled next door. And as the days turned into weeks, I became impatient and I wanted to get a good story. So I thought, I'm going to go into Afghanistan and find out what life is really like
Mm.
for ordinary people under the Taliban. Unfortunately, the Taliban had kicked out all of the media, and they're much more media savvy today, but back then they kicked out all of the Western media, and I couldn't get a visa. So undeterred, I put on the all-enveloping blue burqa and sneaked in with a couple of guides to observe life. We went to Jalalabad, and I wanted to find out from ordinary people, because Tony Blair, our then Prime Minister, and the then US President George W. Bush were both saying this is the most evil, brutal regime in the world. They hate women. They don't let kids fly kites. They don't let girls be educated, you know, horrible people. So I wanted to find out the truth of this, because you know, I wanted to know the difference between the reality, the propaganda, and what was happening on the ground. So I got in, and I was talking to some ordinary Afghan people, and within a day I'd busted a few myths. I met a young girl in her early 20s who was so frustrated because she had been training as a doctor and she was sent back home to her village. And I said, you know, all through a translator, really sorry, but I understand, you know, that the Taliban don't allow women to be educated. And she said, no, that's not true. I was sent home because the college closed down because they couldn't afford to run it anymore. There was no money to pay wages, and her brother, who was also training to be a doctor, said, yeah, I was sent home too. You know, we're both sitting here. We should be qualified as doctors ready to save our people. And yet, you know, we're stuck rotting in this village. So I found this quite interesting because, you know, this was against the narrative that was coming out of Washington. Then while I was talking to this young couple, this larger than life Afghan woman strided in, and she put her hands on her hips, which we all know is international language for trouble ahead. And she looked at me and she said, again, everything through the translator, how many children have you got? And I said, oh, I've got a daughter. She said, just one? I said, yeah, just one. She went, you English and American women, you're all so pathetic. All you can ever manage is one, maybe two children. Whereas me, I can have 16. And when you run out of your boy soldiers, I will be producing more. And I thought, wow. You know, this is not how we see Afghan women, because, you know, we like to see Afghan women as quiet, oppressed, subjugated creatures, and you know, just loads of images of burqas and oppression and women who need rescuing. And this woman certainly didn't need rescuing from anyone. And I said, you know, aren't you afraid of American soldiers, you know, coming into your village? She said, dare one come into my village and I myself will see him off with those pots and pans over there. And I thought, gosh, you know, she's tough. So that was number 2 myth blown. Not all Afghan women are shy, retiring creatures.
Wallflowers, no wallflowers.
Yeah. You know, so anyway, I was there for a couple of days and just generally talking to people. And then Mullah Omar, the spiritual leader of the Taliban, had issued an edict that anyone helping a Westerner during a time of war would be executed. So you can imagine suddenly it was like, get rid of the white woman, you know, we don't need her in our village. So I tried to get back across the border, And it was sealed. So one of my guides said, we'll go through a smuggling route. And I thought, oh yes, that sounds good. I'll get an even better story and everybody will think I'm so brave, going through a smuggling route. So we started out, and of course the terrain was rugged, and I had these plastic Afghan shoes on and my feet were cut and blistered. So I started complaining. One of my guides said, well, can you ride a donkey? And he said, we'll ride across the border. And he took me to these motley creatures that were there. And there's a donkey trader. And he said, can you ride? I said, can I ride? I said, of course I can ride. I ride horses back home. I go over fences. I gallop. Of course, look at this. It's half the size. Same shape, no problem. So he did the deal. What on earth the deal was, I don't know, because I wasn't going back to return it. And I got on the back of this donkey. Well, the animal just shot off, just bolted. And I'm trying to grab the reins, and the wind really caught onto the burqa that I was wearing. And that was flapping, which terrified the creature even more. And it was really going. And I'm trying to lean forward and screaming, and it must have been quite a sight. And just as I managed to get hold of the reins, the one piece of equipment that I'd taken in, a camera, fell out of the folds of my burqa, right in front of a passing Taliban soldier.
Oh my God.
Well, cameras were banned under the Taliban. They didn't like photography at all. In fact, they didn't like much at all. But anyway, he saw this camera, and I don't know if he stopped the donkey or if the donkey stopped, but there was something happened, and up I went, thrown into the air and hit the ground. And I picked myself up, and I'm looking through the grills of this burqa straight into the eyes of this Taliban soldier. And, when I got back to London, my friends had said, what was going through your mind at that precise moment? And I said, well, in truth, for a nanosecond, and it was just a nanosecond, I'm looking through the grill of my burqa straight into, and I just looked at him. I thought, my goodness, you are gorgeous.
What?
Honestly, Rita, he had these amazing emerald green eyes. The famous National Geographic magazine of the Afghan woman.
Yeah.
He was the male version of her. Absolutely captivating. Big high cheekbones, a wild mane of hair, quite stunning. But as I say, that was for a nanosecond, and then
the reality set in.
The reality kicked in, and I just thought, that's it, I'm dead. So he's screaming at me, obviously wanting the camera. So I took the camera off and I handed it to him. And then I stood back and closed my eyes because I'm waiting to be shot.
Oh.
And I waited 10 seconds, and it's a long time, to have your eyes closed, waiting to be shot. And I thought, what's keeping him? And I opened my eyes, and he'd gone. He'd gone to find the donkey trader, because in his mind, if he found the donkey trader, he would find out who was responsible for me.
Yeah.
Which, what man had brought me in, or brought in a camera. And I just thought, oh, I can get away. So I started to walk away, saw a group with 3 women wearing burqas on the end. And I thought, what's one more burqa? So I joined them and drifted away. I mean, it's a magnificent gown for disguise and blending in. And so off I went with this crowd. And then I looked back, never looked back, but I looked back. And there I saw the soldier waving the camera at both my guides. And very soon an angry crowd had gathered around. And I thought, oh, we said if anything went wrong, anything goes pear-shaped, we don't know each other.
Okay.
So I just thought, this has gone pear-shaped, I don't know them. So I continued. And again, I looked back and I just thought, oh, I can't leave them. So I walked back and tried to push my way through this crowd of angry men who were pushing and jostling everybody. And as I tried to push through, it was like, oh, and I was swatted away. This is man's business, no room for a woman. And so again, I tried to push my way into the crowd. Again, I was swatted back, and I just thought, oh. So I took my burqa off. I was wearing a shalwar kameez, I have to say at this stage. Yeah. So I took my burqa off and said in a very loud voice, will somebody let me through? And suddenly everybody went quiet and just thought, where the hell did she come from? You could see it. And I walked towards the gorgeous Taliban soldier, who by this time was looking gormless because he was mouth wide open thinking, what is this? And I threw a quick glance to my guides, thinking they would look back at me and you know, what a brave, noble woman. And so I threw this glance to them, and they looked at me as if to say, lady, we were in trouble. Now we're in serious trouble. So I just realized that this wasn't such a great idea after all. And in the end, we were all, the three of us, just bundled into a car, driven off at speed back towards Jalalabad. And during the journey, the Taliban soldiers started arguing with the driver, and they were both looking at me and arguing. And in the end, the driver stopped the car. The soldier got out, opened the rear door where I was sitting, and he ordered me out, waving his Kalashnikov. And he pointed for me to stand on this raised piece of ground, and then he went over the hill. And I thought, oh, what am I supposed to do now? And I'm sort of looking around thinking, oh, you know, it's a bit of a wasteland. There's rocks and stones. Oh my goodness, this is the stoning corner. He's going to stone me, and he's gone over the hill to get a crowd of people to throw stones. Very soon, within minutes, a crowd had assembled of men who were just staring at me and coming closer and closer. And I'm looking back at them, trying to find a kind face in the crowd, somebody who would be a hero and stop this stoning. And as you can see, the Western propaganda had started to kick in by this time. And I'm looking, and then I remembered as a Sunday school teacher teaching the kids about how Jesus and his disciples had stopped a stoning. This woman was about to be stoned, and Jesus had said, let him without sin cast the first stone, and they'd all gone right and all gone home. So I thought, I'm going to say that, you know, let him without sin. Well, exactly. I mean, the fact I couldn't speak anything other than English, and the fact that they couldn't understand anything other than Pashto, you know, was good.
Oh my God.
But I was in panic mode. So I'm looking round, and I just thought, I'm going to say, you know, let him without sin. And then I noticed these three old men standing at the back with big, long white beards, looking very pious. And I thought, oh, if I say that, they'll probably say, that's us, and they'll start stoning early. Anyway, the soldier comes back over the hill, not with a crowd of people, but with a woman wearing a burqa. And she comes down and she roughly turns me around and starts to frisk me. And I realized that they thought I was carrying a weapon, and that's why he'd gone off. Instead of just doing a pat down then and there, he needed a woman to physically touch me. So she's doing this pat down, and I'm thinking, those men behind me made me think that I was going to have the most horrific death. And I got so angry, I just pulled away from the Afghan woman, turned around at the men, lifted the hem of my shalwar kameez dress and said, "I'm not carrying any weapons, look." And I lifted my dress up. I mean, I had the trousers on and sort of lifted my dress up, and the men just collectively went like that and turned very slowly and then ran as though the devil was clicking at the heels. The woman in the burqa was shocked by this inappropriate behavior. She swung me back round and clashed me over the face because this was highly inappropriate and culturally wrong thing to do. And well, but
you were desperate. You were desperate. You were trying to say, "Listen, I'm innocent. I've got nothing on me."
Exactly. And I was wanting to go to New York. I knew nothing about the culture. So, and then I was bundled back into the car and sent to what turned out to be the intelligence headquarters in Jalalabad. And I was held there for the next 6 days because they thought I was an American spy. And the reason they thought I was an American spy is because they didn't recognize my accent. I come from the north of England by the Scottish border. I live in Scotland now, but this is where I come from. And I said to them, "Look, we don't all talk like the Queen." And they're sort of looking and they're thinking I'm some sort of G.I. Jane character. Which
when you lifted your shalwar kameez, I think they did. Definitely did.
Well, when I looked back and did start to understand the culture, I just realized there was a complete clash of cultures. They brought down this interrogation team from Kabul, great big massive turbans. I didn't realize, but the size of your turban indicates the size of your piety and importance. And they all had massive big black turbans and big black beards. And they sat down and set about sort of questioning me through a translator. I decided at this point they were going to kill me. Whatever happens, I'm going to be killed. Doesn't matter whether I'm nice, nasty, I'm going to be executed. The one thing that's, once I'd become accustomed to the idea that I was going to be killed, the next thing that folks' mind was, well, I don't want to be tortured. So let's cut out the middleman. Let's get straight, from the questions to being put against a wall and shot, and cut out the middleman. So I decided to become the prisoner from hell and just to accelerate my demise. And so I swore at them, I spat at them, I threw things at them, I wouldn't cooperate, I went on.
So at this point, they've got you in a cell. They've got you in a cell, and this is when you're kind of just acting out, spitting at them.
Yeah. And their response was, "Why are you behaving like this? You are our guest. We want you to be happy." And my response internally was, "Why are you behaving like this? You're supposed to be brutal and evil. What don't you understand about your job description?" So it was a complete clash of cultures. They couldn't look me in the face. That I took as a sign of guilt, which I've since learned was a sign of respect. So they're looking everywhere but at me. And I'm thinking, yeah, you can't look me in the eye because you're guilty. And by the third day, or the fourth day, they came and said, "You have lied to us." And I said, "Everything I've told you is the truth." And one of them, through the translator, said, "You never told us you had a daughter." And I said, "Well, you never asked if I had a daughter." "Yes, but you said that you're not married." I said, "But I'm not married." "Well, how can you have a daughter if you're not married?" And I'm looking at him. I just thought, this is, I felt as I'm trapped in an Andy Warhol movie here. So I said, Do you have the concept of divorce in your crazy world? And they sort of looked, you know, and I said, the father of my daughter, we are no more. He lives there, I live there. I said, but we still get on. It's very civilized breakup. And he then said accusingly, why haven't you remarried?
Oh, God.
And I said, I have my own home, I have my own car, I have my own job, I have my own money. Why would I need a man? And before I'd even finished, because I think some of them understood English really, they were reeling, absolutely reeling. And they got up and walked out. They couldn't even look at, you know, in my direction. It was just like, we've got to get out of this room, you know, and off they went. And the translator, I said, what's their problem? He said, oh my goodness, you know, he said they can't bear to be in the same room with you. And I thought, well, what sort of interrogation is this? I'm the one who's, you know, supposed to be. I guess they're still being counseled from the experience. Anyway, the whole thing just went, that's how it went. There was no meeting of minds. They couldn't wait to get rid of me. I was put up in prison in Kabul for another 4 days, and they couldn't wait to get rid of me up there. The prison governor couldn't stand me. You know, I just wasn't cooperating. And it was, I think it was a relief all round when I was released on humanitarian grounds. I don't know, maybe they said to Mullah Omar, either she goes or we go, because, you know, we can't
coexist. We cannot coexist. This ain't happening.
When I got up to Kabul, I was given a change of clothes, and one of the girls that I was locked up with, she was German. She said, would you like a shower? And I went, oh, you've got a shower, that's great. And she took me outside into the courtyard, and there was a pump there, and she gave me a zinc bucket. And she said, crank the pump. So I'm pushing away at this water. And eventually this water started coming out. And I said, this is amazing. I said, how do they heat it? And she started laughing, and she said, it's not heated. This is your shower. And I thought, oh, gosh, you know.
Oh my gosh, hilarious. So you were actually in a cell with other women. You weren't alone.
No, well, when they took me into the prison, they did try and put me into a cell, and they opened a door, and I just said, I'm not going in there. I said, I wouldn't put a dog in there. And I said, look, there's been a big misunderstanding. Just put me in a hotel. My newspaper will pay for it. And they said, no, you are a bad woman. You entered our country illegally without a passport. You are you have to go to prison. And I said, well, I'm not going in there. And then another cell door opened, and these European looking women came out, although they were all dressed in conservative clothes and scarves. And one of them said to me, are you from the Red Cross? And I said, no. And I said, will you tell, I'm not going into that cell. I don't know what. And then I said, oh, you speak English? And they said, well, we're the aid workers that have been locked up since August. And I thought, oh, yes, these are the ones that are accused of trying to convert Christians to Muslims to Christianity. And there were the men and the women were separated, but there was an Australian girl, Diana, who was great. She was like the leader. And there were 3 German girls and 2 Americans. And they said, look, do you want to stay in our cell? And I thought, well, if I ever get out of this place, I'll have more to write about. So I went, yes, please. And so I went into their cell, and that's when, they gave me a change of clothes. The next day I washed my own clothes and hung them up on the washing line.
Wow. Did you ever witness anyone being beaten or getting killed?
No.
Nothing.
No.
So the whole time you were a prisoner to the Taliban, it was pretty much you being the sassiest of the self you could be, the most, probably the most unwelcome guest, spitting at them, throwing things at them, just, being the worst of your possible self. And they, in return, were just being calm about it?
Yeah. As I say, I was totally bewildered. And the day that I did my washing, the prison governor came into the yard, and in his broken English, he said, the washing, remove. And I said, it's drying. And he said, remove. And I said, no, I'm not removing it. And he said, those have to go. And I'm following his line of, and he's talking about my underwear. Now, we're not talking anything small, lacy and salacious here. We're talking big, black, comfortable Bridget Jones knickers. And he's saying, so I said, if you don't like them, you remove them. And I thought he was going to implode, and he spun around and off he went.
Yeah.
And he came back, Rita, I couldn't believe it. He came back with a guy called Mr. McWattle, who was the foreign minister, who should have been involved in international shuttle diplomacy between Washington, Islamabad, London. And instead, he got embroiled in a row about my underwear on the washing line. And he just said, just please remove those items. And I said, what is your problem? This is the female wing of the prison. This is the female prison yard. This is the female washing line. And if you clear off, nobody's going to see my underwear. And he said, no, you don't understand. He said, our soldiers sleep above the female wing of the prison. And he said, if they look out of the window, they'll see those items and have impure thoughts. So I'm looking at my big black flappy knickers in a new light, thinking, wow,
Oh my God, that's hilarious. But
total respect.
It just sounds comical, but when you tell the story, I'm sure, were you like, it's funny now as you say it, the way you say
I was terrified. I was terrified throughout.
Really? Because you're like, you got sass all over you. You can't mess with me, and they're scared of you.
Well, it's like a swan, you see it on this, but it's like, every day I would wake up and think, is this my last day? Every night I would go to bed and think, is this my last night? It was just, but there were these incidents which were hilarious, which came about through a total lack of understanding of each other's cultures. It's just so many different things happened. I was going to say I should write a book, but I have written a book. It's out of print now, but you can get the ebook.
Yes. What's it called? That book, please. Yeah.
It's In the Hands of the Taliban.
Yes.
And it's full of anecdotes like that. And it was just so bizarre. When the war started, I was still locked up, and that was terrifying, being bombed by Britain and America. And I just thought, gosh, if anything's going to make them angry, this is, and they're going to take it out on me. But they came the next day and said, you're going home. And they drove me down from Kabul right to the border. and they were told, don't hand her over to anybody other than the British. The British didn't turn up.
Oh my goodness!
I felt like that. I felt like that kid that gets lost in the supermarket and you're waiting for your parents to show and they just don't show. It's like, oh. So in the end, I was handed over to the Pakistanis. And as I was walking across no man's land, the media, the Pakistani media was shouting over, how did the Taliban treat you? And as I'm walking across, I just thought, gosh, they were actually quite nice, respectful and courteous. And oh, I was so bad. And I thought I should go back and apologize. And I'm almost stopping thinking. And then I thought, no, if I turn around and walk back, they'll say, oh my goodness, she's coming back, shoot her.
But this is what's interesting. Why is it that they let you go? Like, obviously England had nothing to do. There's no diplomacy because they didn't show up for you when you needed them. So why did they let you go?
I think there were 2 or 3 factors playing. My publisher, the publisher of the Express newspapers, was a hard-nosed North London businessman called Richard Desmond. Everything has a price in his world, and that's why he's been so successful. And as soon as news came out that I had been taken, he immediately sent his best negotiator and right-hand man over with a Pakistani heritage lawyer, and they flew over and they started talking with the Taliban straight away, which the Taliban were shocked at because they'd been isolated by the entire world. Nobody wanted to talk to them. Only 3 countries recognized them, the UAE, Pakistan, and Saudi. So this was something, strange for them, but they appreciated it. And the negotiator, Paul Ashford, a tall man with a beard, that probably helped. He rang Richard Desmond back and he said, well, we've had our first meeting, but he said, I didn't bother getting out the checkbook. And he said, why not? Because Richard had said to him, 1 million, 2 million, whatever it takes, just bring her back safe.
Wow.
And he said, well, they're not interested in money. And he said, well, what do they want? Are they asking for weapons? Are they asking for medicines or food? And he said, they're not asking for anything. They just want to be treated with respect. And he, of course, everything has a price in Richard Desmond's world. And he said, I knew these people were sick, but I just didn't realize what we were dealing with. So they were negotiating with them in, just like civilized adults talking and bringing out proof that I was a journalist. They got statements and then they translated all of those into Dari and Pashto, and which they appreciated that as well. And they so they were in regular contact. But on the 3rd or 4th day, the Taliban were handed a dossier, which was also given to Al Jazeera, and I got to see it a few weeks later after I was released. And this dossier was a bogus intelligence file, which made me look to be some sort of super spy. They had authentic documents like my bank account, but it had been altered so that it looked as though that I was getting regular payments from some sort of spy agency. It's a pity they couldn't have backed it up by putting actual money into my account, but they just falsified the records.
Who did that, and why did they do that?
Well, I was told later that it was almost certainly American intelligence because it was a very clumsy, rushed job. And I said, well, why would the Americans want me killed? And I was told, well, it wasn't anything personal, but it would help kickstart the war. And it was, you know, genuinely.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding? I've never heard that part of the story. I've never heard of that.
Genuinely, it would have helped because my story went absolutely global at the time. And it went global because there was nothing happening for 3 weeks in the run-up to the war. And so anything that was different than Tony Blair getting off a plane to meet George Bush, or, you know, this was something different. And so this was because everybody knew that this poor single mum in Britain was captured by the Taliban. If I'd come back in a body bag, a lot of people would have been quite happy. Not because they wanted me to die necessarily, but it would have helped us say, see, we told you they're brutal, evil, and hate women. So, but because it was such a rushed job, and because people who did know me did contact the Taliban and other people as well, because of all of that, I think the Taliban thought, well, what's this dossier? What's the purpose of it? You know, they must hate her as much as we do. Well, tell you what, let's send her back. We'll hang on to all the we'll hang on to all those other nice Westerners, because the Christians were model prisoners. I mean, they were, you know, they were, bless them. But they must have said, well, we'll send her back.
Believable. I mean, were you angry at the American government for doing that? Like, that was really, no?
I mean, there was a few things that I found out subsequently as the years went on.
Okay.
When the fall of Libya happened, I was over there and I bumped into a fighter from who had been in Afghanistan, and he had been in the Al-Qaeda camp down the road. And one of the reasons that they moved me from Jalalabad to Kabul was for my own safety, because the Arab camp had said, why have we got a Westerner there? Why don't we just make an example of her and take off her head? And so this Al-Qaeda fighter was telling me this. He said, yeah, we were wanting to go and chop off your head. And I went, really? He said, but don't take it personally. He said, we didn't know, you know, what would happen, because subsequently I did convert to Islam, but it was about 2 years later. So, you know, a lot of people wanted me dead for their own purposes.
Here you are covering a story, and this is what it's evolved to. You know, you become a little like a football in a political mishmash.
Exactly.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So you were able to escape. Now, how many days in total were you captive?
I was there 11 days, and
11 days.
You know, I do make light of it, but they were terrifying days. And you know, I think it was worse for my family, because I was actually living it and nothing bad or untoward was happening to me. But they only had the propaganda to go on, that this was an evil, brutal regime and they hated women. So she, you know, my mum just thought she, you know, she couldn't bear to sleep because these dark thoughts kept. So it was quite traumatic, but they did send a cleric who invited me to embrace Islam. This was sort of 6 days in. And as I say, it was really surreal, a lot of the things that happened. And I saw this as an opportunity, and I just said, I can't make such a life-changing decision while I'm in prison. But I said, if you let me go, I promise I'll read your holy book when I get back and study Islam. And actually, having watched them closely for those 11 days, I realized that for them, at least, Islam was a way of life. It wasn't just something that you picked up and put down on Friday prayers. It was all about dress, behavior, diet, prayers, you know, everything in their life. When they came into a room, it was Bismillah. Just everything was dictated by Islam. So I just thought, if I am to write with any authority on the Muslim world, I need to know about this faith. And I mean, the little bit that I knew turned out to be wholly incorrect. I thought it was some sort of moon worshipping sect. I really didn't know. Just didn't know. Yeah. So didn't know that the 5 prayers were obligatory, none of that. And so I started reading the Quran, and it was an English translation by A. Yusuf Ali, and there was an index. So immediately I started cherry picking in the back, looking for how to beat your wife, why women shouldn't be educated, all this sort of thing. Of course, I couldn't find it. But what I did find was a very empowering message about justice and the position of women, which was equal to men in terms of spirituality, worth, and education. So what started out as an academic exercise and the fulfillment of a promise very quickly for me turned into a spiritual journey. And I already had that core belief in God. So I didn't make a great leap of faith from Christianity to Islam, because, you know, I'm still worshipping the same God, but a different methodology.
It's interesting because in one of your interviews, you said that, you know, you were a churchgoer. You went to church twice a month, and in secular Britain, that's
I know, I was a fanatic.
Yeah, you're bordering fanatic, going to church twice a month. But what I love this too. If you could tell us the story of what was that incident that had you go from, oh, I'm not sure about Islam, to actually committing to Islam. That that encounter you had with that gentleman at the mosque, I believe it was.
Oh, well, I'd consulted with various Christian theologians and scholars and Muslim scholars. And because of my sort of weird celebrity, I was able to get access to some of the best minds in the Islamic world. So I was really lucky. But I kept stalling on this business of the Holy Trinity, which in Christianity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost. And it had been drummed into me as a kid. And of course, you were just taught not to question and just believe. And so this Holy Trinity business, I just thought, if I abandon the Holy Trinity, that means I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, is also the God. And, you know, it was all jumbled up. And so this brother said to me, you know, what's holding you back? Because you seem to be on song with everything else. And I said, it's the Holy Trinity. And he said, okay, then. And I explained. And he said, what relationship is John the Baptist to Jesus? And I was, well, they were cousins. And he went, right. So when John the Baptist prays to Allah or prays to God, he's going, dear Uncle God. And I said, oh, don't be so ridiculous. He said, well, exactly. He said, you know, you're either a god or a human, and that you can't mix the two. And I thought about it, and he said, when Jesus called God the Father, he wasn't talking about the physical Father or being the Son of God, in as much as we're all the children of God. And he was just saying Father as we would say to God. And I just thought, yeah, and so that that was it. It just really made sense for me.
Amazing.
And so that was about the final hurdle.
And are you now a practicing Muslim?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
Not the greatest, like everybody else.
Yes.
I'll struggle.
Absolutely.
Some days I do great. Other days, let's write that one off and
yeah. We'll take it afresh tomorrow morning. No, that's very interesting, because what's happening now on the ground in Afghanistan, that the Taliban have swept into Afghanistan again in a matter of days. Some people say the transition of power of Taliban coming in was smoother than the US elections that have just passed. And what's really interesting is that on the ground at this very moment, there are protests that the Taliban are not actually Afghan, but from Pakistani origin. And that the women who are now in Kabul, who are protesting that fact, the fact that in Panjshir, that what's going on, the resistance movement that's going on in Panjshir with Ahmad Massoud, that the choppers that are falling down, they're Pakistani, that the Taliban predominantly are Pakistani. What's your analysis of what's going on the ground at the moment, and that the Taliban are not Afghans completely?
Well, I've heard this, and there's a lot of false information, I think, that has been going on. I've looked at the origins of the Taliban, and they just started off as 30 men who had been refugees in the camps in Peshawar and in the madrasas in what was then the old Northwest Frontier province, and that they had taken on this Deobandi style ideology. Then they'd returned home and set up in a village in Kandahar, and didn't have any ambitions to govern or to lead. They just wanted to not contemplate their navels, but they just wanted to immerse themselves wholly in Islam. And then there was this, the country, of course, at that point was totally lawless. The Mujahideen had gone out of control. The warlords were disgraceful. And there was a woman apparently who was raped, and she had her head shaved, and lots of other humiliations, and the family had snapped. And they went to Mullah Omar and his band of merry men and basically said, sort it out, you're coming here spouting all this about Islam. Well, do something about this. And so they went out and promptly killed this warlord, and his men came to them and said, right, well, we're with you. And, it was obviously much more complex than that, but they then went through the country to install law and order, met with some resistance in some parts, were welcomed in other parts. And before they knew it, they had control of about 80% of the country. And I don't think that they ever had ambitions to govern, and they weren't ready for it. They weren't fit for it, really. And we saw that in the decisions that they made, and they were incredibly naive, and they thought that they could just get away doing what they wanted in Afghanistan, and they wouldn't have to engage with the world outside. which was really naive. And of course, their brand of Islam was uncompromising, quite rigid, and must have been very tough for a lot of people to live with. But I do know that Pakistan has helped. I mean, it's one of the worst kept secrets in the world that Pakistan did give shelter and succor to the Taliban in their fight back. But they've had 20 years to reflect on their mistakes. They've had huge influence from Qatar, which puts a big emphasis on education and diplomacy and soft power. And some of that has obviously rubbed off on them. They've been in control, almost running a parallel government since about 2013, 14 in the south of Afghanistan. They've raised their own taxes, they've run their own courts, and none of this has been reported on. There's a very good academic report done by an American called Gillies Dorensword, and he has he's written this paper for the Carnegie Endowment about the Taliban strategy in Afghanistan, and it's fascinating. And he was saying, that they had this network, this administration, this shadow government, but it's just not been reported upon. Perhaps one of the greatest advantages that the Taliban has had is that lazy journalism and propaganda has written them off as barbaric medieval men who run around in flip-flops and carry Kalashnikovs. And that has probably suited their purpose, because maybe they were like that in the early 90s. But, they've got laptops now and iPads and are quite sophisticated. And they have been setting in place this parallel government. And they've obviously also cut deals. And we can see that in this very depressing caretaker government that they've produced with some of the people. I mean, I'm an outsider, so I'm not sure how ordinary Afghan people feel within the country, but I would be very crushed and disappointed. The only good thing that I can take out of the announcement of the new government is the word interim. But we know interim doesn't have a start and an end date. It's temporary, but how long is a piece of string? So I don't know how you felt when you saw the makeup of the government, but it was...
Well, look, what I noticed was there used to be a Department for Women. I don't not know the exact title, but that doesn't exist anymore.
The Ministry of Women.
Ministry of Health seems to be absent from the delegation of ministers who are taking portfolios. So those are the two portfolios that are missing, that are obvious. And so if you don't have female representation in a government that has already been labeled as one that really depresses women in society, I think that would make any female, any father of a female, any husband very nervous for their own family, that it's not moving ahead. There's no voice for a female to shout out what their needs are. and it's taken Western countries a long way to get female representation. I mean, there's arguments now in Australian politics that there's not enough female representation. So, but the point being, it's always a struggle. And then if it's a struggle in Western countries, you can only imagine how it's going in developing countries, where when there's no voice, well then, is there any consideration for the female plight in a country like Afghanistan?
I remember going back to Afghanistan in February 2002. I went in with the BBC to do a program for Radio 4. And I went to meet Sama Seema, the first ever Afghan women's minister. And she wasn't deemed important enough to even have her own office. She was the only ministry without an office.
Yeah.
And that saddened me as well. And again, I blame Bush, Blair, Hamid Karzai, you know, standing there telling us all, this is what we're doing for women. Nobody is being exploited more, I guess, than Afghan women. Although it would be churlish not to acknowledge, yes, you know, we've seen the rise of female judges, of women in positions of power, and, you know, education in some areas has really benefited girls, but it's been largely cosmetic.
Yeah. So you're saying that the plight of women under the Karzai government, under the previous Afghan governments, are in the same position. Maybe it was just a facade, but it's the same lack of representation, where it's, even if it's Taliban or if it's the Karzai or the Ashraf Ghani governments. Is that what you're saying?
It's the problem is men. You know, not just Afghan men. You know, look at Bush and Blair. They sent out their wives to give simultaneous press conferences saying our husbands are going into Afghanistan to liberate the Afghan women. Well, that was BS. And if ever two women were exploited by their husbands, it was Laura Bush and Cherie Blair. It's not just the Taliban, it's not just Afghan men, it's men in general, the patriarchy, the misogyny that, you know, we've all seen. I mean, I keep forgetting that we're talking at different sides of the world, but I've recently read Julia Gillard's biography.
Yes.
She was absolutely, I mean, that blistering session she had in the Australian Parliament, where she totally slammed down this misogynistic man. And reading her story, the, you know, trials that she had just in politics. So, you know, unfortunately, the reality is, if men can control and get away with it, they will. And I think that various governments are jumping on attacking the Taliban because it makes us all focus on them and not the men closer to home. But I remember interviewing Malala Joya, the youngest ever Afghan female MP. And she stood up in the Karzai government and called it out for corrupt behavior. So instead of listening to her, they switched off her microphone. And then she got, so she lost her voice, you know, she's suddenly switched off. And then she got death threats, and subsequently she fled from Afghanistan, although I hear that she's back. If that's so, then, you know, I'm pleased, because, you know, she's another feisty Afghan woman, and the country needs, you know,
Yeah.
these strong, vibrant, intelligent women. Um,
And
and
it's interesting that you say that, Yvonne, because your experience is just so unique. It just doesn't paint the narrative that is going on in mainstream. I'm just curious to know, because we briefly said something about this before we pressed record. Why isn't mainstream media interviewing you on your experience, on your interactions? Because if anyone has anything to say, it's you.
mm, um, I have been interviewed around South America, in
Mm-hmm.
Australia, South Africa, some European countries, but hardly anything in America and Britain, because I say that the Taliban were demonized by the West beyond recognition. And it got so bad that it's very hard to roll back. Even today, the BBC says the Taliban, who refused or would not allow women to be educated. And that is just a lie. I've since met people who were building girls' schools under the Taliban. I met a headmaster in Britain just recently who said to me, you know, when the Taliban came to power, they came to visit us and asked to look at the curriculum because they were wanting to develop a curriculum for the girls, because the only books that they had at the time were left by the Russian occupation, which was obviously promoting
Yes.
communism, which, you
Yeah.
know, they didn't want that to
Yeah.
be continued in the schools. So why the BBC promotes this lie? I mean, let's face it, do you really need to blacken the Taliban name? You know, they did a pretty good job themselves in the 90s. And then at the press conference, I don't know how you felt watching it, I was gobsmacked. I thought, my goodness, you know, the Taliban is talking about women's rights. And that's why I was quite crestfallen when the government was unveiled, albeit the interim government. No ethnic minorities in there,
Yes. Yeah.
and no women. Hopefully, you know, they well, I'm still a bit flawed about it. I just thought that they would have had at least 2 or 3 women in there, and they've obviously had to fulfill promises or pledges to get to power.
And that's exactly true. I mean, even the absence of women, the absence of the minority Hazaras, who are petrified because they are a minority and they have throughout the history not been treated kindly. And anyone would attest to that who has lived in Afghanistan. But what's interesting to me is if Western media hasn't approached you, have the Taliban contacted you and said, hey, you are a success story of ours? I mean, I'm just saying in layman's terms. Would you, like, can we do a collaboration here? You know how we roll. Can you come and do a collaboration? Have they not come to you? I mean, I'm surprised at that even.
I was invited to witness the Doha agreement in Qatar, but that was right on the cusp of the start of the pandemic and lockdown. So I wasn't able to travel. And I said, you know, I can't get to Qatar. And they said, don't worry, we'll invite you when we get to Kabul. So I'm waiting for the invitation.
Oh, wow.
I have been in touch with some key members. People have said to me, "Oh, you should be involved, you know, in the government." And I said, do you not think they've had enough of Western interference?
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's
Really.
true.
And as you know, and they were half joking, but I just found that quite insulting to the Afghan women, because again, while they've been demonizing the Taliban, they've really undermined Afghan women. I mean, you must be fed up of this portrayal of this, wearing the cloak of victimhood and oppression, and being, quiet and shy. And when, I know that that is just, it's not true, and Afghan women are incredibly strong.
Well, just
I
like the women.
remember,
Sorry, go on.
yeah, I remember in the prison in Kabul, the scary governor had come out, and he said something to the prison officers. They were female, by the way, so the Taliban did employ women. And they started laughing. And the Christians who'd bothered to learn the culture and the language, they started laughing too and saying, oh, what's so funny? And they said, oh, he's come out saying, look, at the time, I've got to go and see the boss. And one of the prison officers had said, oh, Mr. So-and-so in the head office. And he went, no, the real boss, my wife. I said I'd be home by 1 o'clock.
Oh, wow.
And so that's what they were laughing at. And that's something that probably every man, not every man, but a lot of men around the world can identify with, because, they begrudgingly acknowledge the power of the woman who runs the household. So, but I just can't hide it, Rita. I am bitterly disappointed on behalf of Afghan women that they haven't included women as yet. But I'm eternally optimistic.
Well, there is no other choice but to be optimistic, especially when the Taliban themselves said, we have changed. We are not the same. Please we are on your side. Like, they gave reassurance and from that reassurance, you would have thought, well, hopefully having Qatar's influence, having had 20 years to readjust, regroup, you would think that they would now be more inclusive, at the least, practically.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that press conference was blinding. It was amazing. But, I did say, well, the words are great. Now let's see the deeds. But I'm afraid if it was homework, it would be sent back and must try harder. It's
true. That's true. Yvonne, I was just thinking about the question just came to me that there was 9/11 changed a lot of things in the world, but it specifically affected you because of this being captive to the Taliban. After you left, and then you were treated kindly by the Taliban. That seems like an oxymoron, to the Western world. You were treated kindly, and then on reflection, you thought, actually, they were actually nice, and I'm going to uphold my promise to look into Islam. And when you converted, how did your work as a journalist, did it change pre being a Muslim to what changed?
Oh, yes. People said that I was suffering from Stockholm syndrome, and I can understand why they would say that, but of course I have to laugh, because I did not bond with my captors. In fact, when I was handed over, I don't know who was happier, them or me, just for it all to end. And in fact, Suhail Shaheen announced that I was being released. And he was saying that she's a very bad woman with a very bad mouth, and she needs to be controlled. And that's what it was quite funny. And this was something that Mullah Zaif, the then Taliban ambassador for Islamabad, said. And so there was absolutely no bonding at all. in some ways, the worst thing that the Taliban did was be nice to me, because when I came out, I told the truth and said they were nice. If they'd knocked me around, chopped off a limb or
Yeah,
something, I'd
yeah,
be a hero now.
yeah,
I'd just
yeah,
be on a constant merry-go-round
yeah.
of interviews.
Hmm, hmm,
But and when I converted to Islam and put on the hijab, the BBC called me the former journalist Yvonne Ridley. And I had to write to virtually every department and say, excuse me, I am still a journalist.
yeah.
You know, wearing a hijab does not change my career. And that took quite a lot as well. So
Hmm,
it's, you know, it has been tough. People don't like the fact that I've converted to Islam, and I've had incidents where people have threatened all sorts because I'm now a Muslim. But the funniest one, it was when I was walking through near Westminster in London,
hmm.
and this man he was drunk, and he sort of staggered up and got to his feet, and he said, "Why don't you go back home?"
Oh,
And I've heard this said to people of color,
hmm,
and he said it to me, and I've got this northern accent, and I said, I do go back home as often as I can.
hmm.
And he sort of looked, and he was shocked. Um, and I have experienced this sort of racism, Islamophobia, um, which I never ever thought that I would do in my life, but there it is. I mean, I'm under no illusions, you know, about white privilege, and that probably played a great part
Hmm.
in my treatment
Yeah.
in Jalalabad and Kabul. And the Westerners that they held there, they were all Christians. They were allowed to hold their services twice a day. They all had
Really?
Bibles. Yeah. And
Wow.
this wasn't quiet sort of contemplative prayer that I was sort of used to. This was hallelujah, praise the Lord, really full on
Wow.
happy, clappy, evangelical.
With the Taliban around them.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Wow.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And I was surprised at that, because I remember standing in the courtyard. I was smoking like a trooper. Although I was on hunger strike, I hung on to my cigarettes, and I was smoking out in the courtyard. Oh, because the girls had decided this was a no smoking cell. How I found the only no smoking cell in Asia. But anyway, so I'm standing out in the courtyard, and they're doing all this happy clappy hallelujah and singing and all of this. And then when they finished, the call to prayer started, and I just thought, gosh, you know, I've got Christian fanatics on that side, Muslim fundamentalists on the other side, and people will imagine I'm being tortured, and I am, but
Yeah.
you know, not in the way that they
Yeah.
expect. The funny thing was, because the Taliban were very iffy on music, they had confiscated their tambourines and guitars, and I thought, thank you.
Peace.
But But having said that, I mean, those girls were brilliant, and their faith got them through their
Yeah.
ordeal.
Mm. You know, you mentioned before, Yvonne, that the BBC referred to you as the former journalist once you had converted, yeah, but you were still a journalist. It didn't matter your faith. When we talk about brands in the media, BBC, NBC, CNN, and you name it, like all the acronyms that exist, uh, when we take a look at brands, Is it true from your perspective that one would need to be cautious when listening to big brands and the anchors and the correspondents and the reporters, because there is an agenda past the news? Like there is an agenda that's going on beyond the newsroom that the presenters have to adhere to. So does one who's the consumer of such news, do we have to be on guard from your perspective?
I wouldn't say on guard, I'd be discerning. And if you hear something from one news source, check it out with another news source. Try and get corroboration. I mean, I've seen so many stories in the Indian media about these fighter jets from Pakistan flying over and bombing Panjshir, and accompanied by video film. And it was just a defense expert had said, hang on, yes, that is an F-16 fighter jet, but that's a training exercise, and it was over Wales. And then there was another one that came out yesterday showing drone attacks, Pakistan again sending drones to Panjshir Valley and using drones to help the Taliban, and all of these images. And this 14-year-old said, no, that's from my Xbox game. Oh. And so, you know, you see things on TV screens. In fact, television is probably you should be more cautious because you're hearing it, you're seeing it, and which is all very convincing, but it could be a lie. So the Indian media in particular has been on steroids recently, I think. With all of the misinformation. But the trouble is, when they come out with that sort of misinformation, it damages when something really horrific does come out. And then people think, well, is that real? Is it made up? And, you know, I really get angry over the whole thing of fake news. So you mentioned one international broadcaster there, and when the Taliban arrived in Kabul the day after, this news reporter was suddenly wrapped up as though she's in downtown Raqqa. And she's standing in front of Taliban soldiers who were shouting, Allahu Akbar, Takbir, Allahu Akbar. And she said, this is weird. They're shouting death to America. And I thought, this is weird, because they weren't. And I, you know, thanks to technology, I was able to run back the, and in case, you know, maybe I had misheard, but I couldn't hear anybody saying death to America in English or in Arabic. And friends who speak Urdu and Pashto later said they couldn't hear it either. So, and this was a hugely respected broadcaster. And I just thought, gosh, can I trust what they're saying in future? So
does that happen on purpose? Like that level of, what's the word? Lie. It's true. It's, to call it what it is, it's a lie. That translation is not correct whatsoever in any definition.
Well, I don't know how. Well, I don't know. I don't know why she said it if she didn't hear it, and maybe she did and we didn't. But you know, I really ran it back a few times to give her the benefit of the doubt, because I hold her in such high respect. That's why I'm not naming her. But you know, it was just really. It was just, as far as I could tell, it just wasn't happening. And and then another reporter was walking round. This was at the height of the airport turmoil. And here, you know, he's saying, I'm walking around in Kabul, the Taliban are here. And he's walking past them, and they're sort of, you know, smiling, and obviously have been told, behave yourself for the cameras. And he's saying, so I'm walking around, and there's a lot of Islamic dress, conservatively dressed people around. And I thought, yes, because you're in a Muslim country,
Yeah.
you know, but and of course, the Westerners had gone.
Yeah.
They were all at the airport or staying indoors. And then he was also saying there's a lack of women on the street. Anybody with any sense would have stayed indoors those first few days, because you just don't know.
Yeah.
Are they going to kick off? Is there going to be fighting? There's no way I'm going to work today, or you know, until I'm called in. So I could understand why there weren't that many women on the street in Kabul. But it's just the way that things are said. The same with kite flying. One of the chances that I got to ask the Taliban about was, why did you ban children from flying kites? You know, what on earth were you thinking of doing by stuff? And they said, well, we didn't ban them in the countryside, but we banned them in the towns and cities, because they run across the rooftops, get overexcited, and they fall over, or they'll get the kites wrapped around the power cables, and they'll pull them, and the power cables, and they get electrocuted. And I said, look, I've flown a kite before, and I said, you can't cut through a power cable with a piece of string. And they started laughing and said, yeah, well, our kite flying is slightly different. And, you know, most of the kites have a wire through them. Sometimes they're dipped in glue and powdered glass. And the whole point is you cut down your competitor until there's only one kite left flying. So if they did wrap around a power line and they pulled them, they could slice through the power line. So I thought, well, I can understand that. And then I realized this is the power of propaganda. I could probably go filming around housing estates in Britain, and no ball games, no skateboarding, and just say, you know, in Britain, children aren't allowed to kick a ball. And people would see that there's a sign saying no ball games. You know, in Britain, children can't even get on a skateboard. And you'd think, what the hell? But this is, you know, propaganda. You get a little grain of truth and then you stretch it. And it's really sad when you, as I say, the BBC today are still promoting the myth that girls weren't educated and kite flying was banned. And they've taken this, or it's been fed to them, and it's become fact. Now then, do you continue repeating a 20-year-old lie, or do you drop it, or do you say, hey, we got this wrong and we're really sorry? And, you know, so far, they're still, you know, promoting this this lie.
So that's really interesting take, Yvonne. So if someone is looking to get into the industry or is in the industry, to speak your mind, to speak what is the truth that you see eyewitness, that is not affiliated with any big brand agenda, would that just be easier to just be a freelancer and be a video journalist, or you know, writing for yourself but publishing openly, but just not working for a brand? Would that be a, what's the word, a more, would that just ignite the passion of why you even got into journalism?
I think that it's still good to go through some sort of formal training. And I don't know whether I'm just getting old and crusty, but you know, my training involved being so precise on locations, on names, on addresses, you know, being accurate, you know, was really drilled into you. And it was a big shame if you got a letter in saying you spelt my name as Smith with an I when it's Smith with a Y and an E, and you know, just little things like that. But it just, I mean, I was listening to a broadcast the other day, and again, it was an international broadcaster, and they had Afghanistan in the Middle East.
Oh,
And, you know, just schoolboy howlers like that. And you think, what's happened to the training of journalists these days? But I, you know, for anybody who wants to be a journalist, I would say to them, it's a fabulous job. It's great fun. But just try and be true to yourself. And, you know, it may be that newspapers and media, different media outlets have a slant on a story. But, you know, you can only stretch the truth so far.
okay.
And
But you
until it
risk your
snaps.
life, like. But I just think most journalists, like you were a visitor to the West. You're a visitor to the West Bank, but you were on the boat in Gaza, the first boat to break the siege of Gaza in 2008. For the first time in 42 years, you were on that boat, and then you were surrounded by Israelis. And in that moment, you thought, "Oh my God, I'm going to die. This is it." And then you get caught by the Taliban. I mean, is that what it's really about? To cut the adrenaline rush is what it's all about? Would that be true?
Oh gosh, it's so difficult. I mean, you know, there is quite a buzz living on the edge, without a doubt. Um, and but the Gaza trip was all about raising the issue of the fact that Gaza hadn't had is on the Mediterranean, and yet they're not allowed to fish. They're not allowed to go more than 2 miles out. Then, you know, some days it's 1 mile, and but it's at that moment in time, I just thought, yeah, we are going to die. I really did think that we were going to die. But I mean, you know, when you're in that situation, there's nothing you can do about it. So running around the boat saying, "Oh, we're going to die," isn't going to help the situation. And nobody did that, to be fair to them. Although there were a few, well, I think we were all concerned at one point.
Okay, I just find that, you know, being right now a video journalist per se, because there's a lot of journalists on the ground in Afghanistan at the moment that I'm seeing their videos. They're not affiliated with any particular news station, but they just upload it to YouTube or TikTok or wherever, and they report from what they're seeing. And I look at what they're doing compared to what is being broadcast on mainstream, and there is a contrast. There is, and that's why I wanted to ask you the question, like, is it necessary to go through a big brand? Because right now, I mean, for the past 15 years, you can do it on your own without having to have backup.
Well, you can. I mean, I've been into Afghanistan with the BBC, and I've been into Afghanistan on my own. With the BBC, you have to go in with your passport and visa. You can't just sneak in. You have security with you all the time. And in Kabul, you're living in a compound or in a hotel, and security will do a check, or it's a bit like the weather, you know, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Or is it safer? And if the security guy says, no, it's not safe, everybody stay where you are, you're not able to go out anywhere, which is really frustrating. but on your own, you can. But of course, there'll be little or no insurance. You are vulnerable. You don't have the backup of security. But then the advantage is you can get around a lot quicker without having to have all the security. As soon as anybody sees a convoy of vehicles, they immediately think that's somebody important, or it's somebody from a big organization. Whereas, I mean, there was one time we went round in a little yellow taxi with fairy dice dangling, and I guess anybody looking to kidnap any Westerners of any value would have just totally ignored this little taxi beetling all over the countryside without air conditioning, and, you know, really quite a rough journey. But we got through. And so there's pros and cons to going in on your own, to going in with the backing and support of a big agency.
Okay, as well as the contacts that the agency has.
Well, yes, that is that as well.
Yeah. Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you wanted to say in this interview, Yvonne?
No, I think it's been quite exhaustive, really. It's been great. It's been, you know, I've really enjoyed it. I just wish that this is you know, Afghanistan is turning the corner.
I hope to God too.
And, you know, it's such an amazing country. And I think, you know, they've got this support from China, not known for its human rights either. But China wants to reopen the old Silk Road trading route. And of course, Afghanistan is in a strategic position for that. And I had heard that, you know, they're already holding trade talks with China, Russia, Iran, and that's important, you know, that they're reaching out to Iran, because that's something that would never, ever have happened with Taliban Mark I. And you know, if they're going to get over this sectarian nonsense, because I do feel for the Hazara. I know they've been horribly persecuted, and if anybody will be disbelieving of the Taliban, it will be them. And with good reason. But, you know, they've said that they're reaching out to the Hazara. I would love to believe that. I did ask them why they had destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas.
Oh, what did they say?
Well, this was really telling. They said, I mean, there was no excuse for it, but they said the world had isolated them. The UN had walked away from them. They weren't getting any aid. People were going through a famine that was so tough, they were digging through the snow just to find blades of grass to eat. It was really horrific. And somebody had reported a story saying, what are we going to do about the Bamiyan Buddhas? Should we just get rid of them? And it was probably somebody just thinking out loud. And they said, suddenly we were deluged with requests from around the world, from countries. Delegations came, and they were all, you know, we've got to save the Bamiyan Buddhas, we've got to do this. And it was like, hold on, we've got 2-3 million people starving to death, and you've ignored that. but you're all rushing in now for the sake of a few rocks. Well, if you want rocks, we'll give you rocks. And I mean, there's hundreds of these statues, but of course it was the two biggest ones, I think, or three biggest ones that they knocked out. And they just blew them up. You want rocks, you can have rocks. And it was a very immature, petulant reaction, but that was what was driving it. It wasn't religion, or, you know, let's get rid of these stone worshipping idols, you know. Otherwise they would have just there was, you know, there's hundreds of them. But it was the reaction of the world.
That's incredible. That's incredible.
Well, we saw a bit of this in the Syrian war with the falling or the destruction in Palmyra. And suddenly a lot of people became interested in the Syrian war, not because it had displaced 11 million people, but because these ancient buildings were being destroyed by ISIS. So it's but that story about the Bamyan Buddhas was quite eye-opening. Oh, the other eye-opening thing that they told me, which I thought was quite telling again, I asked them about their relationship with Al-Qaeda. And they said they came in as our guests and ended up acting like our masters. And that's at that point, I really detected that there was no great love between the Arabs and the Afghans. But I suspect once George Bush launched his war out of necessity, they needed to come together.
That's juicy stuff. That's really juicy. And I mean, I think you would have thanked God the fact that you got inside eyewitness. I mean, like literally, like, yes, it was a scary ordeal being captive by the Taliban, but oh my God, you got the stories of the century. I mean, hello, God loves you. It worked out. It worked out for you. Yvonne, I just wanted to say thank you so sincerely for joining me on the podcast. I've taken more time than what I had said I would, but this is such an intriguing time in the world, what's happening in Afghanistan right now. And I was just so eager to get you here to get your insights. And if the Taliban, in your experience, are the kindness that they showed you, I pray to God that they envelope Afghanistan with that kindness, because it's just been in so much bloodshed for so long that it's absolutely yearning for just some love. The country is just yearning for love. And I pray to God that if they do exist, if they do continue, that they give that love, that give that attention and the kindness that they showed you, and they spread it throughout Afghanistan. So thank you so much for taking the time and taking us through your story in Afghanistan.
Okay, well, thank you, Rita. I've really enjoyed the experience.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. And we'll catch you on the very next episode.